Hey there folks. So in this video what we're going to do is we're going to look inside the project settings and start changing a couple of those kind of default project settings that we're going to need in order to make our project work fine for 2D. So what we're going to do is we're going to go up to edit in the top left corner here, and I'm just going to go down to project settings, and I'm going to open up this window. Now, a lot of these options are going to appear in sections if you go down here and look for things like engine and then go and look for rendering. And also, if we go down and look for things like platforms and windows, there's the most common places we're going to look for these things. But what we're going to tend to do is just actually type in and search from the top. So what should we start with? Well, the first one that we're going to actually start with is we're going to go and look for exposure. And if I type in that, you can see that it will show me where exposure appears in all these different ones. And as I said, engine rendering. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to turn off the auto exposure. Now, why am I doing that? Well, the reason for that is because if you've got the brightness, the lightness of these kind of sprites that we're adding in, because they're using emissives, if we've got that using the auto exposure, what you might end up with is sprites that gradually get brighter and brighter and brighter. You might load into a level, walk up to something, and they start getting brighter. And this is one of the most common issues that I've found when teaching students how to do 2D games, is one of these questions of why are all of my sprites glowing? Yeah, and it's usually to do with this auto exposure option. Now, what we're doing here is we're saying let's turn this off through the whole of our project. You can go in there and start editing your exposure values, things like this, inside of post-processing volumes. So later on, we could add in a post-process volume into our level and control this. But for now, let's just turn this off. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that we can do in here as well, so you can see we can actually mess around with these. I might just switch this one just for now, just to manual, and we'll come back in here later. But yeah, we'll probably add a post-process volume into our whole level anyway, just so we can tweak this in the level itself. Okay, so the next thing that I'm going to go and have a little bit of a look at is actually going in and looking at the motion blur. So if I go and type in motion, you'll see that there's some options here for motion controls, motion blur, motion controls. So obviously we're looking for motion blur, and I'm just going to turn this off because what I want is I want my sprites to maintain their details and their definition as they are moving around. I don't want them blurring. I don't want them all, blending together in order to create that motion. So I'm just going to turn this off, and I'm going to rely on the animations and the pixel art itself to create that for me. The next thing I'm going to look at is very similar to that. I'm going to look for anti-aliasing, and you can see we can actually go in here and turn it off for the landscape mode. Don't need to worry about that. The one we're looking for is the engine rendering. And you see we've got the mobile version and the default version, so the default settings here. Now TSR, temporal super resolution, this is what we're going to see pretty much used as default in all of our 3D games. That's why it's the default here. So what we're going to have a look at is either experimenting with some of these other ones here, so you might get a little bit of use out of potentially one of these other ones, or you might want to just go, let's just turn this off. Same here, you can see like the mobile one, it's recommending to use the fast approximate anti-aliasing. So it's probably not as detailed as the kind of TSR super resolution we're looking for here. But what we can do is we can turn this off. And what this process does, the anti-aliasing, is it removes that kind of those jagged lines on our edges and our objects, smooths that stuff out for us. And that's great on our 3D. But I don't want it to start kind of smoothing out the edges of my pixels and my pixel art. So I can just turn that off here. And that's going to obviously be another useful thing for me. The next one I'm going to look at is I'm going to look for global illumination. Yeah, and that's going to appear again inside of our rendering option. And the reason for this is because in Unreal Engine 5, from I can't remember which specific version, but definitely in 5.6, the default global illumination method that we're going to be using is lumen. And that's great, again, if you've got a 3D game, if you're putting in actual lights and they're lighting up your world. But I don't actually need that, because what we're going to use is we're going to rely on unlit materials in order to actually kind of show up each of these individual sprites. Now, this is one of those ones where the mileage is going to vary depending on the type of project you're going to do. So if you're going to use unlit materials for everything, if you're going to rely on the materials themselves to be kind of visible and showing themselves up on the screen, well, then you don't need lumen. We can actually just go to none, turn this off completely. If you're creating some kind of 2D, 3D hybrid kind of game, where maybe you're using some emissives on your sprites, maybe you've even got particle effects, Niagara particle effects, and you want your sprites to use lit versions of the material, we'll look at the materials in a sec, but if you're looking at it and you're saying, oh, I want to have lit materials, then we're probably still going to want to have some kind of global illumination method on here, possibly even leaving it with lumen, so that things can throw their light and affect their light onto those sprites. Now, to get us started for this, I'm just going to go with none. We're going to rely on our sprites to do all these visuals for us, but just turn that one off onto none. Now, we've just mentioned and talked about sprite materials quite a lot. So what we'll do here is we're going to actually have a look for paper 2D. And I might just need to add the little space in between that one. No, okay, we're not going to find that one. So let's go with Sprite. There we go. I knew it would be there. You can see, look, paper 2D. It's in the name, but it doesn't show up for the sprite. Now this, I've got a couple of options in here that I really want you to become familiar with. The first one is this pick best material when creating sprites. And this is something that Unreal basically does in order to take over for us. When we are loading in a sprite, when we're importing a sprite, it will look at it and it'll go, okay, if I'm bringing this in and I'm creating a sprite, or I'm using this texture, I'm creating a sprite from it, should I use the masked version or the translucent version? That's really the big decision that you're going to see the most common use of this. And what it's going to do is it's basically going to look and say, do you have any kind of opacity values? Any values that fall between 0 and 1? So you're kind of opaque and transparent. If there is a level of opacity in there, then what it's going to do is it's going to favor the translucent version instead. Otherwise, it's going to use masked. Now, it's not perfect, and we're going to have a look at that. I'm going to show you in some examples later on. We're going to drag in some sprites. I'm going to show you how it might presume that it's one when actually we want to use the other. And what I would recommend is you just become familiar with the artwork that you're using, or as a team, you would define whether you are using completely masked sprites, so you only have opaque versus transparent, or are you using a level of transparency. The next one is we've got this default sprite texture group, and it says here that sprites are going to use 2D pixels, and they're going to also use the user interface 2D compression. We'll look at this in a future video where we actually start having a look at how we set sprite texture kind of properties. And then you can see here in these material settings, the default versions for these. And as we've just discussed, there's unlit versions and lit versions. So for the most part, everything that we're going to do is looking at these unlit versions. But in the future, if we come back and start making maybe a bit of a 2D, 3D hybrid, maybe putting in some lights, maybe putting in some particles, something like Siege and the Sandfox as an example of a game made using paper 2D and paper ZD, then maybe we'll start having a look at the lit versions as well. So I'm just showing you where these are, and the reason for that is what you might want to do is you might want to go and make edits to these. And when I say make edits to these, what I would be very cautious of is actually changing anything to do with these base materials. So for example, I've got this masked unlit here. If I was to go and follow the chain that this goes through, you can see it's going to take me inside of engine content, inside of plugins, inside of the paper 2D content. Now I shouldn't go and change this because this is my engine content. If I change it here, I change it for every single use of it. Yeah. So what I really want to just make you aware of is if it's in the engine folder here, don't edit these versions. What you would do is you would go and take this, drag it over. You can see you can drag it over here, move or copy, and you would make your own copies of these. Or you could go in and maybe duplicate it and take a copy over. Yeah, so if you want to make changes, so for example, you want to add some kind of flashing materials, flashing effects and stuff like that when a character takes damage, or you want to have some extra controls in there for recoloring and changing how it actually is rendered out onto the screen, don't do it with any of these default ones. Make your own versions. And if you do make your own versions, well, that means that you can come in here in your project settings and set it to use your default ones instead. Okay, so bunch of stuff there. Obviously, hopefully that sets you up and gets you all working with that. As I said, just be really, really careful with changing anything that exists in the engine content. If you are looking for that and you can't find it, see here I've got this content. You can go into the content drawer and just make sure you turn on your engine content. And also you can see plugin content is going to be there. So you can go and have a look for those things. You don't have to go to the edit project settings options to go and find them. But if it exists in engine, just be really, really careful with changing it. Always make a copy and duplicate and use that version instead. just to keep yourself safe. So if you get those settings set up, hopefully that gives us something that we can start now bringing in our own sprites and making our game content out of. Thanks for watching, folks. If you enjoyed this video, then please consider subscribing to access more of my Unreal Engine content.